So I'm going to cover why we need animal source foods, and this is from a global perspective. I will touch on some data from the US as well. And really, what is the nutritional contribution of animal source foods? They play an important role, especially in undernutrition. And then looking at the health risks from excess animal source food consumption and imbalanced diets. And I will cover at a high level, thinking about environmental sustainability. So this is a large number. 1 billion people have been estimated to not consume enough protein. So this is worldwide. And while that's a large number, many of these people actually don't consume enough calories. So they're not getting the energy they need as well. When we look at micronutrients, new data from last fall shows how widespread deficiencies can be. So these are vitamins and minerals like iron, zinc, folate, vitamin A, etc. And what's pretty shocking is that the majority of women and children globally have at least one deficiency. Many of them have more deficiencies. And these numbers are incredibly high in places like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, where many countries, 9 in 10 women have at least one deficiency. So the vast majority. In the US, many people are surprised that 1 in 3 women in the US have a deficiency. This is women aged 15 to 49. Iron deficiency being the most common. About 20%, a little over 20% of women 15 to 49 in the US have iron deficiency. Of course, iron, one of the best sources is in animal source foods because of the bioavailability and the nutrient density. Now, this is looking at dietary intake data. So the previous one was looking at biomarkers in the body. We see correspondence with what is the quantity of these nutrients that individuals are consuming compared to recommended intakes. So this is busy, but each box represents basically a country and a nutrient. And the darker red the color, the higher the prevalence of inadequacy. And what I want to highlight is that all these countries on the bottom have at least a few different deficiencies where that's very common. So even the higher income countries like the US, but especially when you get into lower income countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, etc., we see deficiencies widespread. And many of these are in nutrients that are most commonly found in animal source foods. Now, this is looking at current food supply globally at the national level from UN FAO data. And what I want to highlight, the x-axis is looking at the percentage of calories from animal source foods, and the y-axis is looking at the estimated prevalence of inadequacy of the food supply in each of these nutrients. And what we see is based on current diets, the further that the population level supply of animal source foods goes towards zero. So the smaller amount of animal source foods in the diet, the higher the risk of inadequacy of these nutrients. And that's because plant source foods and animal source foods have complementary nutrient profiles. So if you diminish too much in either of those, you actually increase the risk. So based on current diets, once you get below about 1/3 of calories from animal source foods, you start to see a lot higher risk of inadequacy. Now, this is summarizing the intake of animal source foods worldwide. The only food group missing here is unprocessed poultry meat. But what we can see is that the region with the highest consumption is actually Central or Eastern Europe and Central Asia. That's often surprising to people. We think high-income countries are the highest consumers. That's not the case. I'll highlight this further, but if you look at specifically unprocessed red meat consumption, high-income countries have a lower intake than the world average. What I want to point out here is that South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa have very low intake levels of animal source foods. So even when you look at sort of recommendations from plant-based advocates, something like the Eat Lancet planetary health diet, many of these countries are falling below even the target values of that diet recommendation, which is about 14% of calories from animal source foods. Now, this is just highlighting how widespread malnutrition is globally. I want to point out 2 particular indicators here: stunting. So child stunting in children under 5, which hinders growth and development. About a quarter, just under a quarter of children are stunted. And a key reason of this is because of inadequate intake of animal source foods and other nutrient dense foods. And then anemia for girls and women aged 15 to 49. almost a third of women worldwide have anemia. Now, anemia has a bunch of causes, but a primary cause is iron deficiency. And we see that correspond with the biomarker data in the study where we look at nutrient deficiencies. So why are animal source foods unique? Well, we know they contain unique nutrients. So things that are not found in plant source foods, retinol, heme iron, vitamin B12, vitamin D, except for certain mushrooms, and zinc, much a more bioavailable form because it's not bound to phytate, which can inhibit the absorption. We see complete amino acid profile, highly bioavailable protein, DHA and EPA, which really otherwise are only found in sea vegetables, which are not widely available. And then recently we've seen potentially beneficial compounds that are not classified as essential, but play a role in health and disease. And those can be important. And there are many unique compounds that are not available in plant source foods that can be beneficial. And lastly, this is recent evidence that looks at the differences of feeding in terms of diverse pastures, animals fed on, over 100 species of crops of different forage, legumes, grasses, contain meaningful amounts of phytonutrients as well, which we're seeing in the meat and milk. So when we look at the nutrient density of animal source foods, we're looking at the nutrients that are commonly deficient worldwide. We looked at iron, zinc deficiency, folate deficiency, et cetera. And what you can see, the green bar is showing the highest density of these foods. The lower the bar, the smaller the bar, the more nutrient dense. On the left is the sort of density per calorie, and on the right is per gram. These bars are showing the portion size or the quantity required to provide an average of a third of the recommended intakes of 6 key micronutrients. You can see organ meats are very dense, small fish, dark green leafy vegetables, bivalves like oysters, clams, mussels, crustaceans like shellfish, shrimp, and then we have ruminant meat, eggs, and dairy being nutrient dense as well. So I highlight that because when we're looking at deficiencies, certainly there's to try to overcome deficiencies, you want a combination of nutrient dense plant and animal source foods. But in terms of the nutrients that are commonly lacking and creating a big public health burden, we see a role for animal source foods in particular. And this is just breaking down this nutrient density by nutrient. You can see some foods are very high in certain nutrients and not in others. And so that's why a diverse diet, people having access to diverse foods of plant and animal origin is important. Now, another interesting feature of animal source foods is their bioavailability. So you may be able to obtain a similar nutrient from a plant source, but the bioavailability often differs quite substantially. So omega-3s, that's a key one, a ratio of about 10 to 1 at best when you convert plant sources, ALA into omega-3 sources. So in animal sources, it's much more bioavailable. Same thing with vitamin A. We have preformed retinol, which is converted at about an average of 12 to 1 from plant sources, carotenoids in carrots, orange flesh, sweet potato, those types of things, dark green leafy vegetables. And then what's really important here is iron and zinc. Now, these are not typically captured in recommended nutrient intakes. So if you look at our sort of nutrition facts panel in the US and you see, oh, this can of black beans provides 30% of the RDA of iron. And this portion of beef provides the 20%. Well, the bioavailability is quite different. That's not captured in that metric. And what we can see here is that when you look at something like beans compared to beef, bioavailability of iron is estimated to be about twice as high in beef. For zinc, it's about 70% higher. So it's an important nuance to capture when we're looking at adequacy and deficiencies here. I won't spend time on this other than to say, showing the quality of the protein in animal sources, other than soy products, animal sources are much higher in terms of their DS scores. And of course, you can combine plant sources of proteins to get complete proteins, but that's can be a challenge, especially in populations that don't have access to diverse foods. So animal source foods are particularly important in certain life stages. In young children, I highlighted stunting, that almost a quarter of children worldwide are stunted. A big cause of that is low consumption of animal source foods. In the breast milk, certain nutrients like B12, choline, lipids, and others from plant sources, I'm highlighting the animal sources here, can actually transfer to the breast milk. The woman's status plays a factor in those levels. And so having a mother without the adequate status actually can diminish the levels in the breast milk. And in particular, for children who are growing rapidly during that first stage of introduction to complementary foods, 6 to 23 months, we see an important role of animal source foods for improved growth, development, cognitive function, and then later in school performance. It's very difficult to meet the nutrient needs of young children without animal source foods or supplements. So even in high income contexts, we see that being a challenge. Now, dairy has been associated with benefits during pregnancy, as well as among adolescents for a variety of outcomes. And now, in terms of overall longevity, we often hear plant-based diets are associated with longer-lived populations, and that's true. However, there is some evidence that it's important to have a moderate amount of animal source foods, and we've seen evidence from Japan and other countries where when animal source food consumption is too low, it's not necessarily optimal for longevity. And there's reasons for that. I think frailty and sarcopenia can be a real factor in not just quality of life, but overall longevity when you think of risk from falls and functionality. And so lean red meat has been shown in randomized controlled trials to have an important benefit on muscle health, and dairy and a variety of outcomes as well. Now, animal source foods are particularly shown to be relevant in evolutionary diets. We looked at hunter-gatherer populations over millions of years ago. We see diets ranging vastly in terms of how much animal source foods, but on average, it's much higher than current consumption, even in high-income countries. So about half of calories are from animal sources when we look at the average. And even modern-day hunter-gatherer societies that have traditional lifestyles and have maintained that have oftentimes have very high intake of animal source foods with low burden of chronic diseases. But there are health risks from overconsumption. I'm highlighting 3 here. There are a lot to consider, but these 3 are sort of where there's the most consensus from dietary guidelines from, for example, the World Health Organization and others, where these have been targeted as the kind of key considerations in terms of moderation. So processed meat has been suggested to be limited or to consume little to no processed meat from the WHO. Unprocessed red meat, guidelines say to moderate intake. Now, what that intake should be is very debatable, and there's sort of a pretty high amount that's been recommended to be, considered excess from the WHO, which is about 350 to 500 grams per week. Some groups will suggest lower amounts to optimize outcomes. And then saturated fat, which there are a variety of sources of saturated fat and a variety of health consequences of that. But in general, the recommendation is to limit to less than 10% of calories. So why is processed meat a problem? Well, the primary reason that the evidence suggests is that it's the additives, it's sodium, nitrates, nitrites, these additives that can contribute to cardiometabolic diseases, that can contribute to cancer risk, et cetera, the overall saturated fat content, and then the way that these foods are prepared. So, for example, just smoking a product can introduce carcinogens into that. So while the recommendation is to consume little or no processed meat, there are probably a range of health effects of different types of processed meat. And so a sort of area of new focus and research should probably be into identifying the most problematic types of processed meat and the ones that can be a bit safer to consume in larger quantities. Where is processed meat consumption the highest? This is just looking at prevalence of consumption. So did you consume this food group in the last 24 hours? You can see there's large variation across countries, even by region. The US is very high, close to half of the population consumed processed meat. I know at the meal last night, I had some processed meat. Probably everybody here did. So we're in that category. Maybe today we won't, and then there'll be an average of 50%. Health risk from unprocessed red meat. So high intakes are associated with non-communicable diseases and mortality. However, when the evidence looks at sort of a balanced diet, a healthy diet, moderate intakes, even pretty large intakes above the average intakes, for example, in the US, have been completely reduced or disappear when you look at a healthy diet overall. So the evidence suggests that a moderate amount at least can really contribute to healthy diets because of the nutrient density, particularly in iron, zinc, and vitamin B12 that red meat can provide. But excess intakes can also be associated with disease risk. There are different ways to prepare and cook the food, same with processed meat, to reduce some of those risks. So of course, the better tasting ways in general, oftentimes they're not the healthiest. There's always a trade-off. So here's looking at that figure of unprocessed red meat. I think this is very interesting because, well, one, there's a huge variation. Look at Central Eastern Europe and Central Asia compared to South Asia. That's quite a difference. Global average is actually higher than high income countries. I think that's important to highlight because we're looking at, well, if we have to moderate intake for environmental reasons or for human health reasons, where should we focus? And I think a lot of the target areas are on high income countries, but that actually for unprocessed red meat is not necessarily the highest, they're not the highest consumers. Of course, for processed meat, high income countries are very high up there. Okay, saturated fat, pretty controversial if you follow this evidence. In general, saturated fat on average increases ApoB, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. There are a lot of nuances here in terms of the type of saturated fat. For example, the difference between having saturated fat from something like butter oil, it's highly processed, versus even heavy cream can actually be significant because of the food matrix. The milk fat globule membrane is much higher in the something like cream or in cheese or in milk, and that has a protective effect in terms of risk. Other factors include the type of saturated fat, so palmitic acid being particularly problematic, other types potentially being neutral or even protective. And so on average, I think when we look at this, the evidence does suggest there's some risk, although I think it's overblown in terms of the contribution to non-communicable diseases. But it would be best to moderate and prioritize foods that are minimally processed. This is just highlighting where saturated fat consumption is the highest. You can see in Europe and Northern Asia, Southeastern Asia, Australia, etc. Okay, so there are many other concerns I won't get into, but this has been covered by others. Some of these are important on average. Most of them are more important if you have a particular risk factor, depending on the person. Now, sustainability, this is at a high level. Others are going into much more detail and have much more expertise than me, but I want to highlight sort of 5 domains that when you look at sustainability of animal source foods, I think it's important to consider. Now, this is looking at land use. And of course, the question of how sustainable are livestock in terms of land use is very debatable depending on how you consider that land that is used. So yes, livestock use a lot of land. I think we see that in the green boxes here, the 2 boxes, we can see pasture and rangelands and grasslands. But important thing to think about here is that the majority of these, so the dark green box, are in rangelands that are not suitable for crop production. So we know this, that even if you did take these out of production, we could not grow crops on these. Either too steep or too rocky or not fertile soil, etc. That's about 1.3 billion hectares. And so if we want to use that land for food production, ruminants are actually a very efficient way if they're managed properly. Soils really depends on the method of production and how those soils are being impacted. So there can be benefits to manure, of course, increasing nutrients and organic matter in the soil, and also the soil health in terms of compaction and how it can regulate temperatures or water infiltration. But excess, there can be a big issue with nutrient losses and gaseous emissions and runoff. So with water, it's similar to land. Livestock use a lot of water, but much of this water is from rainwater, and so it would fall on the land whether or not livestock are on it. They often get blamed. I think water use gets blamed, when you look at the overall water use, but of course, rainfall is going to fall on that land regardless. There are major issues with mismanagement of the in terms of livestock and the nutrient leaks and runoff, but that can be addressed, and it's an area I think that needs attention. Biodiversity is a major factor, and this has to do with a lot of factors. Of course, whenever any type of land is cleared for crop or livestock production, that has a huge impact on biodiversity. I think the important thing to highlight is that there are ways to manage lands, especially lands that can function well as grasslands through grazing management to promote biodiversity. I know there are areas in the world where conservationists are working with ranchers to help conserve. So, for example, in the prairies in the US, really making sure that those prairie grasslands are maintained even with livestock to support biodiversity. I won't spend much time on this because it's covered by others, but climate change mitigation is possible. Again, I think the economic case is huge, which I'm not covering here. How do you actually realize some of these reductions? That's important, but there are a lot of technical solutions, and there is a lot of opportunity in terms of inefficiencies that can be addressed. And Sarah talked about circularity. Up here on the top is looking at a linear system, which has a lot of efficiencies depending on your sort of indicator. How do you measure your productivity? But there are a lot of ways to, when you look holistically at a system, how do you recycle waste, crop residues, inedible portions of food, and of course, waste or crop byproducts or co-products from processing, distiller grains, leftover from wine production, etc. And this is another view of looking at how circularity can help optimize these different areas. So we look at land use, soils, water, biodiversity, and climate change. There are ways to optimize the sustainability, especially when we're thinking holistically across these domains. So not just looking at carbon, but looking at how do we produce livestock in ways that are, yes, we're using land, but that land that is being used is promoting biodiversity. The soil is being maintained or built, restored. We're conserving water, etc. So I will just conclude to say that it's very clear that malnutrition is widespread globally. So this is undernutrition, things like stunting, anemia, micronutrient deficiencies, as well as obesity and chronic diseases. Animal source foods are rich in many of the nutrients that are commonly lacking, and they're bioavailable. And so they are key sources of these nutrients to fill nutrient gaps. And this is especially important in low and middle income countries in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, but we also see these gaps even in high income countries. In general, low consumption of animal source foods does increase risk of undernutrition, especially when we're looking at young children, 6 to 23 months. And looking at the population level, when there is a low consumption of animal source foods, deficiencies and undernutrition is common, and they would benefit from increased consumption. However, there is a risk from excess consumption. So high consuming populations would generally benefit from reductions, particularly in processed meat, and to some extent from moderating saturated fat in red meat. The benefits could also extend to environmental impact depending on the replacement food. So the last thing I'll say is that animal source foods do have a large environmental impact. I think all food production has an environmental impact. We need to sort of weigh that against our needs for human health and other societal needs. But when produced at the appropriate scale and in alignment with local ecosystems, there is a sustainable path forward to have at least a moderate amount of animal source foods. I think that's my perspective. That's also probably what the evidence suggests. I think the question is sort of how much animal source foods, which types, where, what production methods, etc. But I think it's possible. So I'll conclude there. Thanks again. We'll have questions, I think, at the end.